The moment Order 66 activated, CT-7567 stopped being Rex and became something else entirely. Not a machine, not quite human, but a weapon with memories of friendship carved into circuits that no longer recognized the meaning of loyalty. I need you to understand something before I tell you what it was like to have your mind split in half by Imperial programming. When the inhibitor chip fires, you don't lose consciousness. You don't black out or fall asleep while your body commits atrocities. You remain awake, aware, watching through eyes that no longer belong to you as your hands murder the people you swore to protect. The chip doesn't erase your personality. It buries it alive. My designation was CT-7567, though the Jedi I served under called me Rex. For 3 years of the Clone Wars, that name meant something. It meant trust between brothers forged in battle. It meant the weight of command and the burden of keeping men alive in a galaxy that seemed determined to grind them into dust. It meant standing beside Jedi who treated clones as individuals rather than identical products of Kamino's gene labs. But names are fragile things, and when Order 66 came through the comm channels, CT-7567 was all that remained. The chip had been there since my creation. A small piece of technology embedded so deep in my brain that it felt like part of my original thoughts. The Kaminoans had told us it was a behavioral modification device, something to ensure unit cohesion and prevent the kind of individual thinking that could threaten military efficiency. We accepted this explanation because we had no choice, because we were property of the Republic and property doesn't question the modifications made by its owners. But the truth was far more sinister than we could have imagined. The inhibitor chips weren't just behavioral modification devices. They were kill switches for the soul, designed to murder everything that made us individuals while leaving our combat effectiveness intact. They had been installed not by caring creators seeking to improve their products, but by conspirators who understood that the greatest weapon against the Jedi would be the betrayal of those they trusted most completely. I was on Mandalore when it happened, fighting alongside Ahsoka Tano to capture the traitor Maul. The mission had been going well. Bo-Katan's Mandalorians were proving effective allies and my men were performing with their usual competence. The 332nd Company had earned their distinctive helmet markings through blood and sacrifice, their blue and white armor a mark of respect for the Jedi who had shaped us into something more than just identical soldiers. The irony wasn't lost on me later. We had been hunting a Sith Lord while carrying the instruments of Sith victory inside our own skulls. Maul had spoken of a larger conspiracy, of plans within plans that stretched back years, of a coming betrayal that would destroy the Jedi Order. We had dismissed his warnings as the ravings of a madman, never suspecting that the betrayal would come from within our own ranks. Then the hologram of Emperor Palpatine appeared in our command center, his image flickering with the electronic distortion of long-range transmission. His voice carried the authority of absolute power, the kind of certainty that brooked no discussion or delay. "Execute Order 66, he said, and in that moment the galaxy changed forever. The activation was instantaneous. 1 second I was Captain Rex of the 501st Legion, loyal friend to Anakin Skywalker and Ahsoka Tano. The next second I was CT-7567, Imperial asset with new priorities burned into my neural pathways by technology I couldn't resist or override. The chip flooded my brain with chemical signals that rewrote the basic structure of my loyalty, replacing years of personal relationships with cold military programming. But the cruelest part was that I remained aware through it all. The chip didn't shut down my consciousness or replace my memories with false ones. Instead, it created a partition in my mind, sealing away everything that made me Rex while leaving CT-7567 in control of my body. I could still think, still remember, still feel horror at what I was about to do. I just couldn't do anything about it. The sensation was like being trapped in a transparent prison inside my own skull. I could see through my eyes, hear through my ears, feel through my skin. But I couldn't move a muscle or speak a word unless CT-7567 allowed it. My body had become a puppet dancing to strings pulled by imperial programming, while my consciousness watched in helpless horror as familiar hands prepared to commit unthinkable acts. Through eyes that no longer obeyed my will, I watched myself turn toward Ahsoka Tano. She was reviewing tactical displays, her blue and white lightsabers hanging at her belt, trusting me completely because we had fought together through campaigns that bonded us closer than blood. She looked up when she sensed my approach, probably expecting another situation report or tactical update. Instead, she found herself staring down the barrel of my DC-17 blaster pistols. "Rex," she said, her voice carrying confusion rather than fear. Even with weapons pointed at her, she couldn't believe that her friend would threaten her. "What's wrong?" CT-7567 answered for me, his voice using my vocal cords but carrying none of the warmth that had characterized my relationship with Ahsoka. "By order of the Emperor, you are to be executed for treason against the Republic." The words came out flat and mechanical, processed through emotional circuits that had been temporarily severed by Imperial programming. I screamed inside my own skull, fighting against the chemical bonds that held my consciousness prisoner. I tried to throw down the weapons, tried to warn Ahsoka, tried to explain what was happening to my mind. But my body remained under CT-7567's control, my hands steady as they prepared to murder someone I considered family. The partition that contained my consciousness was perfect in its cruelty. I could feel every sensation, process every thought, experience every emotion, but I couldn't influence any action. It was like being forced to watch the most horrific holovid ever created, except the actors were people I loved and the violence was being committed by my own hands. Ahsoka's confusion shifted to horrified understanding as she recognized the cold emptiness in my eyes. She had seen this same look in other clone troopers throughout the galaxy. Good men transformed overnight into executioners by programming they couldn't resist. Her lightsabers ignited in a defensive posture, their blue glow reflecting off my helmet as she prepared to fight for her life against someone who had once protected it. "The Jedi have betrayed the Republic," CT-7567 continued, his finger tightening on the trigger. "They must be eliminated for the safety of the Empire." Each word was delivered with mechanical precision, as if he were reciting maintenance procedures rather than justifying murder. The worst part was that CT-7567 believed every word he was saying. The chip hadn't just changed my behavior, it had altered my perception of reality itself. Through his eyes, Ahsoka Tano was no longer a friend and ally who had saved my life countless times. She was a traitor to be eliminated, a threat to galactic security that required immediate termination. The programming was so complete that it felt natural, inevitable, the only logical response to discovering Jedi treachery. But Rex remained buried beneath this false certainty, screaming warnings that CT-7567 couldn't hear. I knew the truth about Ahsoka's loyalty, about the Jedi's dedication to protecting innocent life, about the bonds of friendship that had sustained us through the horrors of galactic war. I remembered shared meals and quiet conversations, tactical discussions that became philosophical debates, moments of humor that made the fighting bearable. All of that remained intact in my partitioned consciousness, perfectly preserved and completely irrelevant to the Imperial programming that now controlled my actions. The memories were like torture devices, each one a reminder of what I was about to destroy. I remembered the first time Ahsoka had saved my life during the Battle of Christophsis, when her quick thinking and lightsaber skills had prevented a separatist flanking maneuver from overrunning my position. I remembered late-night strategy sessions where she had listened to my concerns about clone casualties and worked to develop tactics that would minimize losses among my men. I remembered the day she had left the Jedi Order, her decision to walk away from everything she had known, rather than compromise her principles. She had said goodbye to me personally, acknowledging the friendship that had grown between us despite the vast differences in our backgrounds and destinies. That goodbye had meant something to both of us, a recognition that some bonds transcended military hierarchy and species barriers. Now I was preparing to murder her, and CT-7567 felt only professional satisfaction at the prospect of completing his mission. The firefight that followed was a nightmare of muscle memory and betrayed trust. My body moved with all the tactical skill accumulated through years of combat training, using the very techniques Ahsoka had helped me perfect to hunt her through the corridors of our command ship. CT-7567 coordinated with other clone troopers who had received the same activation signal, their inhibitor chips transforming them into a perfectly synchronized hunting party. Jesse, Vaughn, and the rest of my men moved through the ship with mechanical precision, their personalities submerged beneath Imperial programming just as mine had been. They spoke in the same flat monotone, their tactical communication stripped of the personal touches that had marked them as individuals rather than identical products. The casual banter and dark humor that had sustained us through 3 years of warfare was gone, replaced by efficient military protocols that treated the hunt for Ahsoka as just another mission objective. Through my partition consciousness, I watched my brothers become strangers. Jesse, who had joked about his haircut and complained about ration quality, now moved with robotic efficiency as he set up ambush positions. His face, which had always been expressive and animated during our off-duty conversations, was now a mask of professional concentration. The man who had once written letters to imaginary family members just to practice basic literacy had been reduced to a tactical algorithm with legs. Vaughn, who had shown me pictures of the civilian freighter crews he hoped to protect after the war, calculated firing solutions with mathematical precision. His dreams of peaceful service, of using his military skills to safeguard trade routes and merchant vessels, had been erased by programming that saw only targets to be eliminated and objectives to be achieved. The gentle soldier who had once shared his rations with hungry refugees was now hunting a former ally with the same methodical approach he brought to equipment maintenance. They were still technically alive, their memories and personalities intact but locked away where they couldn't interfere with Imperial objectives. The cruel efficiency of the chip's design meant that all their training, all their experience, all their tactical knowledge remained available for Imperial use. Only their capacity for independent thought, for moral judgment, for emotional connection had been severed. I could see the precise moment when each of them had been claimed by their programming. Jesse had been coordinating defensive positions when the signal came through. His natural leadership abilities immediately redirected toward hunting the woman he had been protecting moments before. Vaughn had been monitoring communications traffic, his technical expertise instantly repurposed to track Ahsoka's movements through the ship's electronic systems. The transition had been seamless, so smooth that an outside observer might not have noticed the change. One moment they were clone troopers of the Republic. The next, they were Imperial assets pursuing designated targets. Their equipment remained the same, their tactical formations unchanged, their professional competence undiminished. Only their souls had been murdered. The chase lasted for hours as Ahsoka used her Jedi training to evade capture in the maze of corridors and maintenance shafts that honeycombed our Venator-class destroyer. She moved like smoke through the ship's infrastructure, her connection to the Force allowing her to anticipate our movements and stay one step ahead of the trap that was closing around her. But she was fighting not just clone troopers, but men who knew her tactics, who had studied her combat style, who understood her psychological patterns better than any enemy she had ever faced. CT-7567 felt no sadness at hunting someone who had been a friend. The chip had severed those emotional connections, replacing them with the cold satisfaction of a predator closing in on prey. When we finally cornered her in the ship's medical bay, surrounded by Bacta tanks and surgical equipment, He experienced only professional approval at a mission nearing completion. "There's nowhere left to run," CT-7567 informed her, his voice carrying the authority of inevitable victory. "Surrender now, and your death will be quick." The offer was made without irony or cruelty, simply a practical suggestion to minimize unnecessary resistance. But Ahsoka Tano had not survived 3 years of galactic warfare by accepting surrender as an option. Instead of giving up, she did something that changed everything. She reached out through the Force not to attack or defend, but to touch the partitioned consciousness that struggled helplessly within my skull. "Rex," she said, her voice gentle despite the weapons pointed at her. "I know you're still in there. I can feel you fighting." The Force connection was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Through Ahsoka's power, I felt the barriers that contained my consciousness weaken slightly, enough to push a few words through the chemical prison that held me captive. The chip," I managed to force out, my voice cracking with the effort of overriding Imperial programming. "In my head. Find Fives," he tried to warn us. The words came out broken and distorted like a transmission struggling through heavy static, but they carried with them everything I needed Ahsoka to understand. Fives, the ARC trooper who had discovered the truth about the inhibitor chips and died trying to expose the conspiracy. His investigation had revealed the existence of the control devices, but he had been silenced before he could convince anyone in authority to take action. CT-7567 immediately reasserted control, flooding my nervous system with chemical signals designed to suppress individual thought. The effort to speak those few words had cost me dearly, leaving me even more deeply buried beneath layers of Imperial programming. But Ahsoka had heard enough. Her expression shifted from defensive confusion to grim understanding as she realized what had been done to the clone army. "They're not betraying the Jedi," she whispered, her voice filled with horror at the scope of the deception. "They're being controlled." The revelation should have changed everything, but CT-7567 processed it only as enemy propaganda designed to create hesitation and confusion. His finger tightened on the trigger, prepared to end both Ahsoka's life and her dangerous theories about clone autonomy. From his perspective, such ideas represented exactly the kind of seditious thinking that the inhibitor chips had been designed to prevent. The programming was so complete that it included safeguards against its own discovery. Any attempt to discuss or analyze the chips triggered additional layers of suppression, making it nearly impossible for affected clones to communicate the truth about their condition. CT-7567 experienced genuine disgust at the suggestion that his loyalty might be artificial, that his dedication to Imperial service might be the result of technological manipulation rather than natural conviction. But Ahsoka had one advantage that the chip's programmers hadn't anticipated. Her connection to the Force allowed her to interact directly with the neural pathways that contained my consciousness, bypassing the technological barriers that kept Rex locked away. It was incredibly dangerous, requiring her to maintain mental contact with my partitioned mind while avoiding the weapons fire of soldiers who had once protected her. The fighting that followed was unlike anything in my experience as a soldier. CT-7567 coordinated with other clone troopers to systematically search the medical bay, using tactics that had been developed for hunting Jedi specifically. Every entrance was covered, every possible escape route monitored, every piece of medical equipment examined for signs of tampering or sabotage. Meanwhile, Ahsoka worked frantically to understand the nature of the technology that controlled us. She used her lightsaber to slice open computer terminals, searching through medical databases for information about clone physiology and the modifications that had been made to our brains. The irony wasn't lost on either of us that she was conducting this research while being hunted by the very people she was trying to save. Through the Force, I could feel her growing understanding of what had been done to us. The chips weren't just simple control devices, but sophisticated neural interfaces that could rewrite personality structures while leaving motor functions and technical knowledge intact. They had been designed by experts who understood both clone psychology and Jedi capabilities, creating weapons that would be perfectly suited for betraying the Republic's defenders. The revelation of the chip's true purpose filled me with rage that had no outlet through CT-7567's emotional suppression systems. We had been created specifically to serve this function, our entire existence orchestrated by conspirators who saw us as nothing more than expendable tools for their political ambitions. Every battle we had fought, every sacrifice we had made, every moment of brotherhood we had shared had been tainted by the knowledge that we carried the instruments of betrayal inside our own heads. But the rage was followed by something worse. The understanding that most of my brothers would never learn the truth. They would live and die as imperial assets, never knowing that they had once been capable of independent thought. The chips would protect them from the psychological trauma of understanding their situation, but they would also prevent them from ever choosing their own destiny. The procedure took place in the ship's medical bay, with Ahsoka using surgical droids to locate and remove the inhibitor chip, while CT-7567 fought to regain consciousness and complete his mission. It was like brain surgery performed under combat conditions, with the patient's body actively trying to prevent the operation from succeeding. The surgical droids had been programmed for clone physiology, their databases containing detailed information about the modifications that had been made to our neural structures. But the inhibitor chips weren't listed in their standard protocols, suggesting that knowledge of their existence had been restricted to a very small number of individuals within the Republic's medical establishment. Ahsoka had to guide the droids manually, using her force sensitivity to locate the chip within my brain, while CT-7567's programming fought to maintain control of my body. The process was agonizing for everyone involved, a delicate operation made infinitely more dangerous by the fact that the patient was actively resisting treatment. Through my partitioned consciousness, I could feel the surgical instruments probing through my brain tissue, searching for the device that had stolen my identity. The chip was smaller than I had expected, no larger than a grain of rice, but capable of overriding decades of personal development and emotional growth. Its removal required precision that tested the limits of both medical technology and force-enhanced perception. CT-7567 fought the procedure with every resource at his disposal, trying to regain consciousness and mobility despite the anesthetics that Ahsoka had administered. The programming included safeguards against tampering, backup systems that activated when the primary chip was threatened. Multiple times during the operation, I felt secondary control protocols attempting to take over, weaker versions of the main programming that tried to preserve Imperial loyalty even if the primary device was removed. When the chip was finally extracted, a device no larger than a grain of rice but capable of overriding decades of personal loyalty, the relief was immediate and overwhelming. The chemical barriers that had kept my consciousness imprisoned dissolved, allowing Rex to reclaim control of his own body after hours of helpless observation. The first sensation was physical pain, as if someone had been pressing on a nerve for hours and finally released the pressure. The second was emotional devastation, as the full weight of what I had almost done crashed down on me without the protective numbness of Imperial programming. The third was gratitude so profound that it threatened to overwhelm my ability to function, directed toward the woman who had risked everything to save not just my life but my soul. The first thing I did was throw down my weapons and collapse to my knees, overwhelmed by the horror of what I had almost done. The second thing was to look up at Ahsoka Tano, this woman who had risked everything to save not just my life but my soul, and try to find words that could express my gratitude and shame. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though the words felt completely inadequate for the betrayal I had been forced to attempt. I couldn't stop myself. I knew what I was doing, but I couldn't stop. The memory of those hours under chip control would haunt me for the rest of my life. The sensation of watching my own hands prepare to murder someone I loved, of hearing my own voice justify acts that violated everything I believed in, of feeling satisfaction at the prospect of completing missions that would destroy the republic I had sworn to protect. The chip had made me complicit in my own corruption, forcing me to participate in the betrayal while remaining aware of what I was doing. Ahsoka knelt beside me, her hand gentle on my shoulder as she helped me process the trauma of having my mind split in half by Imperial programming. "It wasn't you, Rex," she said, though we both knew the truth was more complicated than that. It had been me, in a sense. My body, my training, my knowledge of her tactics and weaknesses all turned against her by technology that cared nothing for friendship or loyalty. But understanding the mechanism of betrayal didn't erase its psychological impact. I had pointed weapons at someone I considered family. I had hunted her through corridors where we had shared conversations about the war and the future. I had prepared to execute her for the crime of trusting me. The fact that Imperial programming had forced these actions didn't eliminate the guilt that came with remembering them. The chip that Ahsoka had removed lay on the medical table between us, its surface gleaming with a sinister beauty that belied its horrific purpose. Looking at it, I could hardly believe that something so small had been capable of rewriting my entire personality structure. The device was a masterpiece of miniaturization, its circuitry so complex that even the medical droid's scanners couldn't fully analyze its function. "How many others?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be devastating. "How many of my brothers are still under chip control?" Ahsoka's expression provided the answer before she spoke. "All of them, Rex. Every clone trooper in the Grand Army of the Republic is carrying one of these devices. Order 66 activated every chip simultaneously, turning the entire clone army into Imperial assets overnight." The scope of the betrayal was almost impossible to comprehend. Millions of clone troopers, good men who had fought and died for the Republic, transformed in an instant into weapons against everything they had once protected. The systematic corruption of an entire military force, achieved through technology that had been implanted before most of us were even conscious enough to understand what was being done to us. The worst part was knowing that similar scenes were playing out across the galaxy. Thousands of Jedi were being murdered by clone troopers who had fought beside them for years, their trust and friendship twisted into weapons more deadly than any lightsaber or blaster. The inhibitor chips had turned the clone army into the perfect instruments of betrayal, using the very bonds they had formed with their Jedi commanders to ensure the success of their assassination missions. Through fragments of communication traffic that we intercepted during our escape from the command ship, we learned the scope of Order 66's implementation. Jedi Masters cut down by clone commanders who had shared meals with them the night before. Padawans executed by troopers who had protected them through countless battles. Temple guards overwhelmed by soldiers they had trained alongside for years. The betrayal was total, absolute, and utterly devastating to both sides of the relationships it destroyed. Master Windu, dead by the hand of clone troopers who had once saluted him with genuine respect. Master Yoda, forced to flee from men who had followed his tactical guidance through dozens of campaigns. Master Ki-Adi-Mundi, gunned down by soldiers who had learned strategy from his example. Each death was a personal tragedy multiplied by the knowledge that it had been carried out by people who had once been friends and allies. I thought about my brothers in the 501st Legion, good men who had been transformed overnight into instruments of Imperial will. Appo, who had always been careful with civilian casualties, now leading the assault on the Jedi Temple where younglings cowered in terror. His natural protectiveness toward non-combatants had been redirected into ruthless efficiency at eliminating designated targets regardless of their age or threat level. Bo, who had joked about his poor aim, now hunting survivors with mechanical precision. The self-deprecating humor that had made him popular among his squad mates had been replaced by grim focus on mission completion. His supposed poor marksmanship had always been exaggerated anyway, a way of deflecting attention from his actually impressive skills. Now those skills served Imperial objectives without any trace of the modesty that had once characterized their application. Korik, who had dreamed of opening a cantina after the war, now serving an empire that saw clones as disposable assets rather than individual beings. His plans for post-war civilian life, his carefully saved credits and detailed business proposals all rendered meaningless by programming that recognized only military service as a valid form of existence. The man who had once calculated profit margins for imaginary restaurants now calculated casualty rates for very real operations. They were all still alive in the technical sense, their bodies functional and their basic personalities intact beneath layers of Imperial programming. But the men I had known were gone, replaced by loyal servants of Emperor Palpatine who felt no conflict about their new roles. The chip had given them purpose, certainty, and freedom from the moral complexities that had occasionally troubled them during the war. From their perspective, Order 66 was a liberation rather than a tragedy. It had freed them from the burden of individual choice, from the confusion of conflicting loyalties, from the pain of forming emotional attachments that could be used against them. They served the Empire now with perfect dedication, never doubting their orders or questioning their objectives. It was a kind of peace, even if it came at the cost of everything that made them human. The psychological conditioning that accompanied the chip's activation was as sophisticated as the technology itself. CT-7567 hadn't just been programmed to follow orders. He had been given a complete worldview that justified Imperial service and demonized opposition to galactic order. Every action taken in service to the Empire felt morally correct. Every target eliminated was clearly deserving of death. Every order received was obviously the product of superior wisdom and strategic thinking. This wasn't simple mind control in the crude sense of forcing someone to act against their will. It was personality reconstruction that made Imperial service feel like the most natural thing in the world. CT-7567 had genuinely believed that murdering Ahsoka was the right thing to do, not because he was being forced to believe it, but because the chip had altered his capacity to evaluate right and wrong. As we prepared to escape the command ship, Jesse appeared in the corridor ahead of us, his DC-15 rifle trained on our position with professional steadiness. His face showed no recognition of our years of service together, no hesitation about shooting his former captain and a Jedi he had once protected. The chip had severed those connections, leaving only the cold efficiency of a loyal Imperial soldier. "Captain CT-7567, he said, using my numerical designation rather than the name that had marked me as an individual. "You have been compromised by enemy action. Return to your station for immediate medical evaluation and chip replacement." Chip replacement. The words hit me like a physical blow as I realized that the Empire had prepared for this possibility, that they had contingency plans for dealing with clones whose inhibitor chips failed or were removed. Jesse's perfect calm suggested that he saw my current state not as freedom, but as a malfunction to be corrected through proper medical intervention. The implications were staggering. The Empire hadn't just planned for the initial activation of Order 66. They had anticipated resistance and prepared responses for every possible contingency. Backup chips, reconditioning protocols, termination procedures for clones who couldn't be restored to proper function. The conspiracy was more thorough and sophisticated than any of us had imagined. "Jesse," I tried, hoping to reach some fragment of the man I had known beneath the Imperial programming. "Don't you remember our conversations about what we'd do after the war? You wanted to see the oceans on Camino to understand where we came from." The memory was specific and personal, something that had come up during a late-night conversation when we were both on watch duty. Jesse had been curious about Camino's natural environment, wondering what the planet had been like before the cloning facilities were built. He had talked about swimming in the oceans that surrounded the cities, about experiencing the world where we had been born as something other than training facilities and barracks. But Jesse's expression remained unchanged, his rifle steady as he processed my words through the filter of chip-enhanced loyalty. Nostalgic attachment to pre-imperial objectives indicates severe programming corruption, he replied, his voice carrying the same flat monotone that characterized all chip-controlled clones. Report for immediate medical intervention to restore proper function. The clinical language was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his response. Jesse had been transformed into someone who viewed his own memories and emotions as symptoms of malfunction rather than expressions of personality. The chip hadn't just suppressed his individuality, it had taught him to see individuality as a disease that required treatment. The firefight that followed was brief and devastating. Ahsoka disabled Jesse's weapon with precise lightsaber work while I tried to find non-lethal ways to neutralize someone who had once been my brother. But Jesse fought with the same tactical skill and relentless determination that had made him an effective soldier. His personal safety irrelevant compared to his mission of recapturing Imperial assets. Watching him move, I could see traces of the man I had known beneath the Imperial programming. His preferred firing positions, his movement patterns, his tactical thinking all remained fundamentally unchanged. The chip had preserved everything that made him useful as a soldier while eliminating everything that made him Jesse. It was like fighting the ghost of my brother, a hollow shell animated by Imperial priorities. When he finally fell, stunned by Ahsoka's force powers rather than killed, I knelt beside his unconscious form and looked into a face that remained familiar despite the alien thoughts behind it. This was what the war had really been about, I realized. Not Republic versus Separatist, not freedom versus tyranny, but the systematic dehumanization of beings created specifically to be used and discarded by those in power. The clone army had never been citizens of the Republic we fought to defend. We had been weapons designed to eliminate threats to galactic stability, including the threat posed by our own creators if they ever outlived their usefulness. The inhibitor chips were just the final expression of that instrumental relationship, the ultimate demonstration that we existed to serve others rather than ourselves. We left Jesse alive but unconscious, taking his weapons and equipment while hoping that he might somehow recover from the programming that had stolen his personality. But I knew the truth even as I entertained false hope. The chip was too deeply integrated, too thoroughly designed to be easily removed. Jesse would wake up and continue serving the Empire with perfect loyalty, never knowing that he had once been capable of independent thought. Our escape from the command ship required abandoning most of my men to their Imperial programming, leaving behind soldiers I had trained and fought beside for years. Each one we encountered had to be treated as an enemy rather than a brother, their familiar faces made strange by the mechanical precision of their movements and the empty certainty of their voices. The transformation was complete and heartbreaking to observe. Men who had once expressed individual opinions about everything from food quality to tactical doctrine now spoke with identical phrases and inflections. Soldiers who had developed personal relationships with their squad mates now treated their former friends as interchangeable assets. Officers who had agonized over casualties and mission parameters now made decisions with algorithmic efficiency. As we made our way to the hangar bay where Ahsoka's ship waited, I caught glimpses of clone troopers systematically destroying evidence of our previous relationships. Personal items were being incinerated, informal unit insignia removed from armor, photographs and mementos collected for disposal. The chip didn't just change their behavior. It made them want to erase the very memory of who they had been before Order 66. The process was thorough and heartbreaking to observe. Men who had treasured small tokens of their individuality were now treating them as contraband to be eliminated. Friendships that had sustained them through years of warfare were being classified as dangerous attachments that interfered with Imperial efficiency. Even their names were being abandoned in favor of numerical designations that emphasized their nature as identical products rather than unique individuals. CT-7567 had wanted this too, I realized. During the hours when the chip controlled my body, he had felt satisfaction at the prospect of abandoning the name Rex and all the emotional baggage that came with it. The programming presented Imperial service as a kind of ascension, an evolution beyond the messy complications of personal relationships into something cleaner and more purposeful. From the chip's perspective, friendship was weakness. Loyalty to individuals was inefficiency. The capacity to question orders was a design flaw that needed correction. Order 66 hadn't just been about eliminating the Jedi. It had been about transforming the clone army into the perfect servants of Imperial will. Beings who could commit any atrocity without hesitation or regret because they no longer possessed the emotional framework necessary for moral doubt. The hangar bay where we finally reached Ahsoka's ship was filled with clone troopers preparing for deployment to other theaters of operation. They moved with mechanical precision, loading equipment and supplies without any of the informal conversation or personal interaction that had once characterized such activities. The casual humor and shared complaints that had made similar scenes bearable during the war had been replaced by efficient silence as our stolen shuttle cleared the command ship's hangar bay. I looked back at the vessel that had been my home for years and felt a grief so profound that it threatened to overwhelm my ability to function. Everyone I had ever cared about was still aboard that ship, but they were no longer the people I remembered. The chip had murdered them as surely as blaster fire, leaving behind loyal Imperial assets wearing familiar faces. The hyperspace jump that carried us away from Mandalore was supposed to represent escape and salvation, but it felt more like abandonment and exile. We had saved ourselves by leaving our friends and brothers to serve an empire that saw them as disposable resources rather than living beings. The guilt of that choice would follow me for the rest of my life, a constant reminder of the price paid for individual freedom in a galaxy where most clones never had the chance to choose. During the long hours of hyperspace travel, Ahsoka and I discussed what we had learned about the inhibitor chips and their role in the Empire's plans. The technology was sophisticated beyond anything the Republic had been willing to acknowledge, capable of rewriting personality structures while leaving technical competence intact. It suggested years of development and testing, probably conducted in secret facilities where clone welfare was considered irrelevant to the pursuit of military efficiency. How many of our missions were really about testing the chips, I wondered aloud, thinking back to operations that had seemed to require unnecessary risks or inexplicable tactical decisions. How many times were we sent into situations designed to stress our programming rather than achieve military objectives? The question opened up disturbing possibilities about the true nature of the Clone Wars. Had certain battles been fought specifically to test clone loyalty under extreme conditions? Had some of our casualties been the result of experiments designed to measure the limits of our conditioning? Had the entire conflict been orchestrated not just to eliminate the Jedi, but to perfect the technology that would make that elimination possible? Ahsoka had no answers, but her expression suggested that she was remembering her own strange encounters with clone behavior during the war. Moments when good soldiers had acted with surprising callousness, times when individual initiative had been suppressed in favor of rigid adherence to orders that made little tactical sense. The signs had been there for anyone willing to look, but the Jedi had been too focused on winning battles to notice the systematic corruption of their allies. "Fives tried to warn us," I said. remembering the ARC trooper who had sacrificed his life attempting to expose the conspiracy. He discovered the truth about the chips and died trying to tell someone who would listen. If we had believed him, if we had investigated his claims instead of dismissing them as stress-induced paranoia, maybe we could have prevented this. The memory of Five's death was particularly painful now that I understood what he had been trying to accomplish. He had been closer to exposing the conspiracy than anyone realized, his investigation revealing not just the existence of the chips but their true purpose. His death hadn't been the tragic result of clone trooper instability, but the calculated elimination of someone who threatened to uncover the greatest deception in galactic history. But Ahsoka shook her head, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom about the nature of galactic politics. The chips were part of a plan that had been in motion for years, maybe decades. Even if we had exposed them, Palpatine would have found another way to eliminate the Jedi. The war itself was just a tool to position his pieces for this moment. The insight was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant that individual choices hadn't determined the outcome of galactic history. Terrifying because it suggested that resistance had always been futile against forces too large and sophisticated for anyone to comprehend. The clone army had been created specifically to serve this purpose. Our loyalty and effectiveness turned into weapons against the people we had sworn to protect. As our journey continued, I found myself struggling with questions about identity and autonomy that had no easy answers. Was Rex really a separate person from CT-7567, or just another layer of programming designed to make clones more effective soldiers? Did my resistance to the inhibitor chip represent genuine free will? Or had it been built into my design to serve some imperial purpose I couldn't understand? The chip had felt natural when it controlled my actions, as if murdering Ahsoka was the logical response to discovering Jedi treachery. But my current feelings of friendship and loyalty felt equally natural, equally consistent with my understanding of right and wrong. If both states of mind could feel authentic to the person experiencing them, how could I trust my own thoughts and emotions? The fact that you're asking these questions proves that you're free, Ahsoka told me when I shared my doubts about the nature of my consciousness. The chip doesn't generate uncertainty or moral complexity. It provides certainty, purpose, freedom from doubt. Your struggle with these issues shows that you're thinking for yourself rather than following programming. Her words provided some comfort, but they couldn't eliminate the fundamental uncertainty that would plague me for years to come. Every decision I made, every emotion I felt, every moral judgment I reached would be shadowed by the knowledge that my mind had been designed by others for purposes I might never fully understand. The chip was gone, but the questions it raised about the nature of clone consciousness would persist. The philosophical implications were staggering. If the chip could rewrite my personality so completely that CT-7567 felt like my authentic self, what did that say about the nature of identity itself? Were personalities nothing more than patterns of neural activity that could be adjusted like the settings on a piece of equipment? Was consciousness just an emergent property of sufficiently complex programming, whether biological or technological? Or, when we finally emerged from hyperspace near a remote system where we could safely plan our next moves, the first thing we did was monitor Imperial communication channels to assess the scope of Order 66's implementation. The reports were devastating in their clinical efficiency. Jedi eliminated with minimal clone casualties, Temple secured with no significant resistance, remaining survivors being hunted by forces who knew their tactics and capabilities intimately. The Empire presented these achievements as victories against traitors who had threatened galactic peace, but I knew the truth behind the propaganda. Each eliminated Jedi had been someone's teacher, friend, or protector. Each secured facility had been a center of learning and wisdom. Each neutralized threat had been a person who had dedicated their life to serving others rather than seeking power for themselves. I thought about Anakin Skywalker, the Jedi Knight who had shaped me into more than just another clone soldier. His lessons about thinking creatively and caring for the men under my command had been the foundation of my identity as Rex rather than CT-7567. Now he was probably dead, cut down by clone troopers who had once fought beside him, or worse, turned to the dark side by the same forces that had orchestrated the clone army's betrayal. He was like a brother to me, I told Ahsoka, who had served under Anakin's command before leaving the Jedi Order. Even when I didn't understand his decisions or agree with his methods, I knew he cared about keeping my men alive. He treated us like people rather than assets. Ahsoka's expression suggested that she knew something about Anakin's fate that she wasn't ready to share, probably information too painful to discuss while we were still processing our own trauma. The silence that followed my words carried its own weight, a recognition that the people we had known and loved were gone in ways that went beyond simple death. Our monitoring of Imperial communications also provided insights into the systematic dehumanization of the clone army in the aftermath of Order 66. Clone designations were being standardized to eliminate any trace of individuality. Personal relationships between soldiers were being discouraged through psychological conditioning. Any behavior that suggested independent thinking was being classified as a malfunction requiring immediate correction. The efficiency of the process was remarkable and horrifying. Within hours of Order 66's activation, the entire clone army had been transformed from a collection of individuals into a uniform mass of Imperial assets. Names were replaced with numbers, personal possessions confiscated, informal unit traditions abolished. The Empire was systematically erasing every trace of clone identity that extended beyond military function. The Empire didn't want soldiers who could think for themselves or form emotional attachments that might interfere with their missions. They wanted perfect servants who would follow any order without question, commit any atrocity without remorse, and die for Imperial objectives without hesitation. The inhibitor chips had been just the first step in this transformation, preparing the clone army for integration into a military system that valued efficiency over humanity. Most disturbing of all were the reports about defective clones who had somehow resisted or overcome their programming. These individuals were being hunted down and either terminated or subjected to intensive reconditioning designed to restore proper Imperial loyalty. The Empire was taking no chances with clone autonomy, treating any sign of independent thought as a threat to galactic security. The reconditioning protocols were described in clinical language that masked their horrific reality. Behavioral correction, personality adjustment, loyalty enhancement. Each phrase represented procedures that would strip away everything that made a clone individual while leaving their military skills intact. It was psychological torture disguised as medical treatment, designed to ensure that no clone would ever again be capable of questioning Imperial authority. "We can't save them," Ahsoka said when I expressed my desire to somehow rescue my former brothers from their programming. Even if we could remove every chip in the clone army, most of them wouldn't want to be saved. The Empire has given them purpose and certainty. Taking that away would be cruel rather than kind. The insight was accurate but painful to accept. My brothers in the 501st Legion were probably happier now than they had ever been during the war. They served with perfect confidence in their cause, never troubled by moral doubts or conflicting loyalties. They had been freed from the burden of choice, from the pain of losing friends, from the uncertainty that came with thinking for themselves. It was a kind of peace, even if it came at the cost of everything that made them human. The psychological conditioning that accompanied chip activation wasn't just about suppressing individual thought. It provided a complete worldview that justified imperial rule and demonized opposition to galactic order. From the perspective of a chip-controlled clone, the Empire represented stability, prosperity, and protection for ordinary citizens. Rebels and Jedi were threats to this peace, dangerous radicals who would bring chaos and suffering to innocent populations. This wasn't crude brainwashing that could be easily detected or overcome. It was sophisticated psychological engineering that made Imperial service feel like the most natural and moral choice possible. The clones weren't being forced to serve against their will. They were being given new wills that aligned perfectly with Imperial objectives. As we prepared to leave the remote system and begin whatever life awaited us as fugitives from Imperial justice, I took one last look at the clone army's communication traffic and said goodbye to men I would never see again. Jesse, Vaughn, Apo, Korik, and thousands of others who had been my brothers in everything but blood. They were still alive, still serving with distinction, still fighting for what they believed was right. They simply believed in something that required them to hunt people like me. The final transmission I intercepted was from Captain Apo, now commanding the 501st Legion in my absence, reporting the successful completion of security operations on Coruscant. His voice carried the same mechanical precision that had characterized all clone communications since Order 66. But underneath the Imperial programming, I thought I could detect traces of the man I had once known. "Mission accomplished," he reported. "No surviving Jedi contacts identified. Clone assets performing within acceptable parameters. Requesting new operational assignments for continued service to the Empire." Clone assets. That's what we had become in the Empire's eyes, resources to be managed rather than people to be valued. The phrase encapsulated everything wrong with the system that had created us, used us, and ultimately discarded our humanity in favor of mechanical efficiency. We had never been citizens of the Republic we fought to defend, never been granted the basic rights we died to protect, never been considered worthy of the freedom we helped secure for others. But hearing Apo's voice also reminded me of something important. Beneath the Imperial programming, my brothers were still alive. Buried under layers of chemical conditioning and technological control, the men I had known and loved continued to exist. They couldn't express their true thoughts or feelings, couldn't act on their personal values or relationships, couldn't even remember what it felt like to choose their own paths. But they were still there, waiting for someone to find a way to set them free. That became my mission in the years that followed. My reason for continuing to fight when it would have been easier to disappear into the galaxy's outer rim and try to forget the war. Somewhere in the Empire's vast military machine, good men were trapped inside their own minds, forced to serve masters who saw them as disposable tools rather than living beings. They deserved better than abandonment, better than being written off as irredeemably lost to Imperial programming. The inhibitor chip had taught me what it meant to be imprisoned in your own body, to watch helplessly as someone else used your hands to betray everything you believed in. That experience would haunt my dreams for years. But it also gave me something invaluable. The knowledge that consciousness could survive even the most sophisticated forms of control. Rex had endured beneath CT-7567's programming, and I had to believe that my brothers could endure beneath theirs. As our ship disappeared into hyperspace, carrying us away from the ashes of the Republic toward an uncertain future in the Imperial era, I made a promise to myself and to the men I had been forced to leave behind. I would find a way to break the chains that bound their minds. I would prove that clones were more than the sum of their programming, and I would ensure that the sacrifices we had made during the Clone Wars meant something more than just the replacement of one tyranny with another. The inhibitor chip had tried to murder Rex and replace him with CT-7567, a loyal Imperial asset who felt no doubt about his purpose or loyalty. It had failed. but only because Ahsoka Tano had risked everything to save not just my life but my soul. Most of my brothers hadn't been so fortunate. They remained trapped in the mechanized hell of perfect certainty, serving an empire that valued their compliance over their humanity. But consciousness, I had learned, was more resilient than its creators imagined. Somewhere beneath the chemical fog of imperial programming, my brothers were still fighting, still hoping, still remembering what it felt like to be free. They were waiting for someone to find the key that would set them free from their prisons and restore their voices. They were waiting for rescue, for redemption, for proof that their lives had meaning beyond military service. They were waiting for their captain to come home. The war wasn't over. It had simply changed into something more personal, more desperate, and infinitely more important than anything we had fought for during the Republic's final years. This was no longer about political systems or territorial boundaries, but about the fundamental question of what it meant to be human in a galaxy that increasingly saw humanity as a weakness to be corrected rather than a strength to be celebrated. The inhibitor chip had shown me the face of the enemy, and it wasn't the separatists or even the Sith. It was the cold, mechanical certainty that reduced living beings to functions, that transformed people into assets, that prioritized efficiency over empathy and order over individuality. That enemy had won the Clone Wars by convincing everyone that victory required the surrender of everything that made victory worthwhile. But wars could be won again. Chains could be broken, and even the most sophisticated programming could be overcome by the simple human refusal to surrender hope in the face of overwhelming odds. The galaxy had grown dark in the shadow of the Empire, but darkness was where the real fight would begin. Not for territory or power, but for the souls of good men who deserved better than slavery disguised as service. The inhibitor chip was gone from my head, but its legacy would follow me for the rest of my life. Every time I made a choice, I would remember what it felt like to have that choice stolen. Every time I felt loyalty or friendship, I would remember how easily those emotions could be manipulated by those in power. Every time I trusted someone, I would remember the betrayal that came from inside my own mind. But I would also remember Ahsoka's courage in risking everything to save me, and the hope that came from discovering that consciousness could survive even the most determined attempts to destroy it. Those memories would sustain me through the dark years ahead, when the Empire's power seemed absolute and resistance appeared futile. They would remind me that freedom was always possible, even when it seemed impossible, because the human spirit was stronger than any technology designed to control it. That was what it meant to be a clone trooper with an activated inhibitor chip. To be buried alive inside your own mind while watching your body betray everything you valued. But it was also what it meant to be human in a galaxy that had forgotten the value of humanity. To endure, to resist, and to never stop fighting for the freedom to choose your own path, no matter how dark that path might become. The chip was gone, but the fight it represented had only just begun.